Welcome to Poland Daily Culture. On today's episode, we're at Krzeczyn Mały Palace in the Polish western countryside. We're going to be meeting the Nicolay family and telling you all about this historic palace and the surrounding area.
The palace in Krzeczyn Mały is a Baroque palace from the 18th century. In 1997, a French family coming from Belgium, Count and Countess Guillain de Nicolay, bought the estate and started renovating it. Since 5 years, their son, Count Charles de Nicolay, is patiently taking care of their new house in Poland. In our episodes, he will tell us about the history of the palace as well as about his family.
So Charles, your family doesn't have any sort of direct Polish roots, but as I understand it, maybe there is some if you go far enough back into history.
Yes, well, quite far. The first Polish king, Mieszko, is one of my ancestors, but it's going through German ancestors, because there were weddings between Polish and Germans, and then Germans and French. So that's how it went. But actually, our family is of Italian origin, from Florence in Tuscany, and they came to France with the popes during the war between the Guelph and the Gibelins in the 14th century. And as they were working for the popes then, they followed them to Avignon, where the popes spent three popes were in Avignon for about 100 years before going back to Rome. And our family stayed in France at that time, and in the 15th century moved to Paris, where they served the French kings. There were generals, ministers, bishops, men of war also. There was one Maréchal de France, a member of the l'Académie Française, the French Academy of Literature. There was a chancellor of Naples. A chancellor is the prime minister. But it all ended during the French Revolution. Well, some of them were guillotined, which was ended. Others followed Louis XVIII abroad and came back with him after Waterloo. And they stayed during the reign of Louis XVIII and Charles X. And they immigrated again after the revolution of 1830 and followed Charles X, which was much less common than during the real French Revolution, because as they were cutting heads, everyone who didn't want that emigrated. As for the revolution of 1830s, most people stayed because there was no physical danger. And this part, my part of the Nicolay family, were very close and to the king, and one of my great-great-grandmothers even went with them to Prague, quite next to here in Czech Republic, which was in Austro-Hungarian Empire then, to teach the grandchildren of Charles X school. And when this was finished, they spent the 19th century in Switzerland, this part of the family, and one of my great-great-grandfather married a Belgian woman, so the 20th century was Belgium. They built this house in Loupointe, which we were talking about before, because they didn't want to come back to France until the king didn't come back, which I believe is not so close. He's not so close to come back in France. So 19th century was in Switzerland, 20th in Belgium, and maybe 21st century will be in Poland.
Right, there you go. Charles, tell me, is it strange living your life in a small Polish village far away from growing up in Belgium?
I think it's much more easier now, today, for me than it was for my parents when they arrived here, because they arrived at the end of the 90s, well, the middle 90s, the first time they came here. Well, there was the language barrier, which was quite difficult here because it took them some time to learn Polish. And people here didn't speak or spoke only as another language Russian. So that was quite difficult for them. And they lived with my sister and I in a little typical apartment, communist apartment in the town next to here, in a big block, as you can imagine them. So it was difficult for them to get used to it, and there weren't the big shops like we can find them here today. But no, now it's very nice, especially continuing the work of my parents. It's very gives a lot of enthusiasm to continue after them, to rebuild this place, to redo the gardens. Here is very interesting.
Of course, the sort of surrounding area itself is quite sort of interesting and has developed in an interesting direction over recent times. With you've got the flourishing copper mine industry.
Yes, in the town next to here, which is called Lubin, they discovered in the 60s that there was some copper under the earth. It's one of the biggest copper mines in the world, one of the biggest Polish companies, which is here. It's called the KGHM. And it gives work to a lot of people who live around. When they discovered it, we were saying before that most of the people who live in the village come from what is today Ukraine, because they came in after the war. But when they discovered the mine, people came from the whole of Poland. And this town of Lubin, which used to have 15,000 people living there, now has 100,000. So it's really a melting pot here, people from all over Poland.
So tell me, is it difficult to maintain such a house?
It's not difficult, it's a joy of every day, but it's not easy either. When you build a new house, everything works very, very fine. Here, it's always something, or the heating system, or the plumbery, because all things are quite old, or we have new techniques which are used, techniques of the 21st century, used in a house of the 18th century. So it makes everything more complicated, but very interesting too. We put this a few years ago, a new heating system, which is very ecological. We use only the wood that we produce here in the gardens, in the forest here. It's very interesting to be able to do that kind of new things.